Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for research methods. In this lecture, we will be talking about research ideas and hypotheses. So as a preview of this lecture, it's a little bit shorter than normal. We're going to be looking at the research process with the learning objective to be to identify the early steps in the research process. We'll look at generating a research idea sources, looking at comparing and contrasting sources of research ideas. We'll look at how to do a literature review, or at least the overview of it. So learning objective 3 is to understand the components of a literature review. Learning objective 4 is going to be to conduct a comprehensive literature review. You will not be doing that this week. You will be doing that in an upcoming lab. But that is the learning objective there. So once you do that in the lab, that will satisfy that learning objective. And finally, the characteristics of a good hypothesis with the learning objective of being able to identify and demonstrate the characteristics of a good hypothesis. All right, let's jump right into it. This first learning objective is to identify the early steps in the research process. So step 1 is to find a research idea. And we kind of talked about this already in the first lecture, but this is the step in the process where you basically are identifying a general topic that's of interest to you. And you can identify this in many different ways. You can identify it based on observation of other people, of other things. You can identify it based on something you read, just an idea you had. There's a lot of different ways to identify a general topic that interests you. However, then the important part is to explore previous research in that topic to develop a research idea or question. So one of the early important concepts is to look at what's already been done on that topic. Let's say you come up with a really cool thing, you think it would be a really cool study, you just do the study without looking what's already been done. Well, it could be that it's already been done. That exact study could have already been done and they found specific results. Replicating research isn't a bad thing, but maybe they identified some issues with their study, how it was run, and you run into those same issues because you didn't read it already. It could also be that related research has been done, so it's good to find that out. It could be that the research has been run and they didn't find what you're looking for. All different kinds of things. So really important that you explore previous research in that topic so that it helps you develop a specific research idea or question. So from that, we get to step 2, which is form a hypothesis. We form this hypothesis based on the general idea and then the literature review that you do to look up what's already out there on that topic. A hypothesis, we'll talk about these later, but a hypothesis is very specific. So this is something you'll come up with in a lab, is basically a very specific research hypothesis. Then you're going to specify how the variables will be defined and measured. So this is essentially the first step of your methods of your paper. You're going to look at what you're going to be measuring, and you're going to look specifically at how you're going to measure it. But one important concept when it comes to measuring variables is you have to operationally define those variables. If let's say you're measuring depression, well, first you have to determine what measure you're going to use for depression, but even before that, you have to define what depression is specifically in your research study. Since depression is a wide range of things, you have to be very specific with your definition, your operational definition of what depression is. Another example is loyalty. What is loyalty? Is loyalty being there for someone? Is loyalty basically sticking through even despite adversity? Those are things that you have to basically define when you're in this third step. And finally, identify the individuals who participate in your study. That is very important because you want to generalize your research. So the individuals that you're going to have in your study, the participants, you want them to be as um, representative as possible of the population you're going to generalize to. And describe how they'll be selected and provide further ethical treatment. And this goes back to what we covered in ethics. So, 4 steps. Find your idea, research the idea and form your hypotheses, then specify how the variables are going to be defined and measured, and finally identify the participants and make sure that that you have proper selection and proper treatment. Objective number 2, compare and contrast the sources of research ideas. So for this one, what we're looking for is basically how are we going to find our topic? How are we going to identify it? So that's that first step on the previous one, but now we're going to define more of how we're going to find this and identify it. You can pick a topic about which you want to learn more. It's actually recommended that you do something that you're at least either a little familiar with or that you have an interest in it, because otherwise you might get bored or you might not put in as much effort for it. So pick a topic of which you want to learn more. Then casual observation is one important source of finding research questions. Watching the behavior of people or animals. You might watch people and you find that they are acting a certain way, and you want to know why they're acting that way. So this is where that casual observation comes in. Observe people, observe animals, and then from that maybe it'll come up. You'll be able to come up with a question for why are people behaving in a certain way at a certain time in a certain place, that type of thing. Another is reports of others' observations. So informal sources or formal sources. So it might come from non-academic sources like magazines or newspapers, but it might also come from academic sources. So finding information that's already been presented out there, whether it's research articles that are in existence, maybe there's something that's catching your interest. You've got a passing interest in a certain thing. Let's say there's a certain category of depression you've got a passing interest in. You then can read a couple journal articles in that, and maybe that'll help you generate a research idea. Just as easy as magazines and newspapers, because most of those are based on academic research, but it doesn't even have to be based on academic research. It could be just somebody's blog and they're reporting what they've seen. The whole point of this process is that we're not taking what others have said as law. We are taking what others said and coming up with a research idea and then scientifically testing it. Also, practical problems or questions, things like stemming from daily life, how various different things in your daily life take place or occur, and there is basically a large amount of research that's done that's basically designed at directing towards solving practical problems or solving theoretical issues. So there's a lot of research out there on that. So if you know of a problem or an issue, doing research or coming up with a research idea revolving around that is a good idea. And then there's just behavioral theories. You look at all the theories in psychology and the behavioral sciences, and you find that these theories have specific predictions on how people will act and behave in specific situations. Some of these have been tested, many of them have, but some of them have not been tested. So testing predictions that are part of a theory is a good source of finding more or finding a research idea. The next learning objective is understanding the components of a literature review. So as I said before, you're going to be conducting a literature review on your own, but what are the components of it? So first, we've just got the literature. The literature is going to be the mass of published information worldwide, both formal and informal. So the literature is just what's been published out there. Your job is going to be to identify a handful of academic studies, so academic papers, so academic reports, directly related to your research idea. It does sound daunting, but there's things that you can do to make it less daunting. There's things that you can do to make it easier. A major component is cross-referencing. Another component is summaries, reading abstracts, finding secondary sources that can lead you to primary sources. So finding something like a Wikipedia article that can lead you to academic articles that are based on that topic. This cross-referencing, I can't stress this one enough because this one is one where you find one article and then you skim through that article and look at things that have been cited in that article and you go to those sources. You can take and go from one thing to find many, many things after that. Some tips for starting a review of the literature. First, do your homework. Collect background information. So this is where you want to go out and read books or journal articles that are talking about, in general, the topic you're looking at. You're not getting specific yet. You're not getting directly down to the specific research hypothesis you're looking at. You're instead looking more general. So this is where you can find a book on the topic or maybe a journal article that's talking about the topic in general. But it's also important to note, do not try to read everything. Read enough to gain a good grasp on what is going on in general with your topic so that you know how to get more specific, or you know when you get more specific that you understand the not just your topic but the related topics, the related things. So if you're looking at a specific type of depression, you should have a general understanding of what depression is and the different types of depression. But time management is huge here. Don't try and read everything. You do not have enough time to read everything. Even somebody who's got a very specific field is going to have trouble reading everything in that field. Unless there's only like 4 researchers in the world researching in that field. There's just too much going on in general. Like for even mine, when I look at like mate retention tactics, there's just journal articles coming out all the time with different things related directly or even indirectly related. So there's just not enough time to read everything. So don't try to read everything. Learn when to skim, learn what to look at, like abstract stuff like that. But you do want to have a good grasp of your topic. Also, keep an open mind. You want to begin with that general topic and let the background reading lead you to a more specific topic. You could have a more specific topic in mind before this, but by starting general, you may get new ideas when you're getting to a specific topic. You may figure out that that specific topic you originally had in mind isn't what you're going to do. You may find out that that specific topic is exactly what you want to do, and the general topic led you exactly to that. Be critical, ask questions as you read, question everything. Question all the research that's already been done. If somebody found in a research study a specific thing, don't take it as if that is true. Question, was there an issue with this study? Has it been replicated? Things like that. So be critical and maintain that degree of flexibility. You don't want to go into this process saying, this is exactly what I'm going to look at, because then you will discount information that goes against that, and you will only look at information that supports what you're looking at. And that is a huge problem. That's a type of bias where it's a confirmation bias is technically what it is. It's where you only see or pay attention to things or value things that confirm what you're looking for and ignore the things that disconfirm. So maintain that degree of flexibility. Realize that what you're looking for, what your idea is, it may not be the best idea. It may not be the thing you're going to have as your final research topic, your final hypothesis. Keep that open to the possibility that research that's already out there might change it. And then as you go on, focus, focus, focus. So we started general, we kept an open mind, we found the general stuff, we learned some stuff. Then you need to start focusing. Then you need to focus more. Then you need to focus more. So once you develop one research question and find the relevant background information, then find more specific and more specific and more specific. And take it one step at a time. As you're going through and you're finding things, don't try and jump ahead steps. Just take it one step at a time. I already mentioned this next thing, primary and secondary sources, but let's define that real quick. So, primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are going to be basically first-hand reports in which the author described their own observations. This is where you're gonna look in things like journal articles, theses and dissertations, anything you can find where it is a researcher who researched that specific thing. And they publish it, and they will typically publish that one time. They might do a related study later where they publish that, but they publish it once. Then secondary sources are where basically the authors are going to discuss someone else's observations. Introductory sections of research reports. The intro of the introduction of a research report, of a study. It's sometimes as little as 1 page long, it's sometimes as much as 50 pages long. But the intro is basically the author of that specific study talking about previous studies that have been done that led them to their current study. So finding information in secondary sources like this is very important for you, because you find that primary source, that one study that is just really good, but then go through their introduction and find other studies that have been done that they cited that you can also go to and read and cite. And textbooks are good for this too, because textbooks, if the textbook has your specific topic, this textbook will typically have some citations of primary sources. So a secondary source is where someone else is citing a primary source in order to use their work, the other person's work, to support the work that they're doing. A third type, it's a secondary source, but it's one where you cite directly. So typically you won't cite a secondary source. You won't say, if you find a primary source that was cited in a textbook, and you find it in the textbook, you're not going to cite the secondary source there and basically use that. You're going to go to the primary source and cite the primary source. The one exception to that is meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are secondary sources in which they took and compiled a bunch of primary sources on a very specific thing. You can cite meta-analyses as if they are primary sources because they're, in a sense, doing their own research, but their research is on the other research that's already been done. They ran their own statistics on the research that's already been done. So kind of to review, what is the 2 basic goals or the purpose of a literature search? The first is to gain a general familiarity with the current research in your specific area of interest. And again, I've said this a few times. It's very important that you understand the current research that's out there and the research that's been done on your topic of interest. That is just as important as conducting the research itself, because not knowing what exists out there can cause you to make flaws in your research, flaws that other people have probably already made and published about. And so in a sense that they have done the work for you, it's just a matter now of reading what they published so that you can then take that and utilize it. And second, to find a small set of research studies to serve as the basis of your research idea. So general familiarity is important, but then finding a very small set of research studies that have been done as close as possible to what you're looking at to serve as the basis of your research idea or the basis of what you are doing. Because that's going to, that small set, they're going to lead you to your research idea. So you want to find a set of published research reports defining the current state of knowledge and hopefully identify a gap in that knowledge base that your study will attempt to fulfill. One way you can get this is to go to things like future directions. A lot of research studies, journal articles will have a future directions or limitations at the end of their study, and you can use those to find where that gap in knowledge is. So how does research grow out of old? New research grows out of old by starting with these historical studies here, main foundation historical studies. Then you're going to get major branches off from that. Depending on how early in that specific theory you are, the branches might be more and more specific. And then from the major branches, you get down to more specific. Here we're going more specific. And then finally, you get more specific to what your current research is. And again, depending on how long that theory's been out, how long people have been doing research on that specific topic, the branches before you get to where you are may be more or less. It could be that you are doing some groundbreaking research on a new theory or a new field. In that case, you're going to be more towards the bottom of this. But it's still that theory, that field is going to be coming out of something else. So there's still previous stuff prior to this. There's still previous trees even down there prior to this. And it just happens to be your current one might be a new field, but it's still a new field that came out of an old one. This gets us to our fourth learning objective, and this is the one I said you're not going to be doing right now, but you will be doing coming up in a future lab, and that is conducting a full literature search on a specific topic of interest. So how do you do a literature search? What is the process of a literature search? First, you're going to be attempting to narrow down your general idea to a specific research question. The more specific, the better, but again, you might have to start looking at what's out there to be able to get more specific. And then once you've narrowed it down to that specific research question, so you've read the literature that's out there. That's not conducting the literature search yet. You're just reading what's out there. You're reading books, you're reading journals, you're getting a general idea of the field, of the subfield you're interested in, whatever it is. Then once you've narrowed down your general idea to a specific research question, you want to go out finding all published information to document and support that specific research question. So specific research question, you want to find everything you can related to that. And a good starting point, as I already said before, is recently published secondary sources, textbook, chapter headings, subheadings, other articles that you can look at through their introduction, things like that. Anytime you can find other sources that will lead you to better sources. One thing that quite often happens when you're doing research is you are doing research in a specific thing and you're trying to find what's out there for it. And you read a journal article that's kind of related but not directly related, and then you're skimming through their intro and they talk about the specific thing you're looking at that somebody else already researched and you haven't found that article, so you go to that article and you find out that's perfect, that's a perfect source. So these secondary sources are a really good starting point. Textbook chapters are really good too if the textbook is getting specific enough to your question. The textbook might lead you to other secondary sources, which will then lead you to primary sources. Make note of subject words. Correct terms or subject words. Identify and describe the variables in the study and characteristics of the participants. Quite often you can use that as a search term. I don't personally use this as a search term, but it is a search term, subject words specific, that you can use. So a lot of articles, when they're published, they'll have right after the abstract a list of subject words, and those subject words should come up in searches. So if you find specific subject words that work for your study, that can be a good tool. Make note of authors' names, because the same author names will be encountered repeatedly, and if you find them over and over and over again, they're likely the leading researcher in that field. So they might be not even the first author, they might be the second author, the third author, the last author. You'll find that quite often the last author might be a major researcher, and then the first author was one of their grad students, or is somebody working with them. But that major author, the last author that's repeatedly in a bunch of different things, he's the one that you're going to be looking to and seeing where his other research is, because other people might have worked with him, or he might have published stuff directly himself. As far as online databases, so PsycInfo is one of the best ones. PsycArticles is another great one. ERIC, which is Education Resource and Information Center, Medline, all of these are very good sources of very good databases to find journal articles within. However, my biggest recommendation above and beyond all of that is Google Scholar. Go to Google Scholar, search for your article. If you can't get full text of that article, then take that article you found and go back to one of these and search in those to see if you can get full text at those. But your first step, in my opinion, is to use Google Scholar. Google Scholar's got so many good tools. You can limit it by dates. You can search for authors. You can search for various different things. It's just so handy, and it's basically a compilation of all these other ones. Google has basically perfected the ability to search for specific things. I find that if I'm looking in PsycInfo or PsycArticles, I can't find the specific thing with my search terms. However, I can in Google Scholar, and once I've found the title of an article, I can then go and look at that in PsycInfo or PsycArticles. So it's basically comes down to what I recommend: start with Google Scholar and then branch out from there into the other things once you've found it in Google Scholar. Unless you've got a way to get full articles of Google Scholar. If you've got a way to get full articles of Google Scholar, that's an entirely different animal. Then you just have to, then you can use just Google Scholar. You don't have to use these other ones. Let's talk about something very important, and that is time management. Now, time management is extremely important. Yeah, my writing there is sloppy. Because you do not have enough time to do everything you need to do. You do not have enough time to read all the things you need to read, research all the things you want to research, listen to all the podcasts or books you want to listen to, play all the games you want to play, go to all the parties you want to go to. Whatever it is, you don't have time to do all of that. No one has time to do everything they want to do. So one of the best skills you can learn is time management. And when you're doing a literature review, when you're doing research, how does time management come in? Time management comes in being able to quickly and efficiently identify useful sources of information. And how you do that is by weeding out irrelevant material. So first thing you do, use the title as your basis or as your first basis for screening. So you're looking at things, you're starting your literature review, you're starting to look at what's out there. Start by looking at titles. Most people name their titles something very specific to what they're researching. Some people get creative with their titles. Some people get a little bit eccentric with their titles. The reason people do that is because it's believed as a researcher, if your titles are attention grabbing, that more people will read it. Whether that's the case or not, even then, generally, titles are pretty specific to what the research is. So use that title as your first basis. Then, after you've found a good title, use the abstract as your second screening device. So pretty much for the majority of articles I've ever read, I would say for 90% of the articles I've ever read, if not more, and I've read probably thousands of research articles by now, but 90% plus, when I say I've read thousands of research articles, I've looked at parts of thousands of research articles. 90% of them, I never read anything beyond the title and the abstract. That is what is common. The title in a properly done abstract will give you all the information you need to know, unless it is something very specific to what you are researching or something that you find very interesting. So the abstract, it basically summarizes the entire paper. You get the title, you get to the abstract, you read the abstract, that summarizes your that paper. It is possible then that you'll want to then skim the intro and discussion if that article is relevant enough. If that article is something you're looking for, skim the intro and discussion. If needed, then you can read the entire article carefully. But rarely are you going to read an entire article carefully. That just takes too much time. Maybe it's a 4-page article and you can read it in 5 minutes. No big deal. What if it's a 15, 20, 30, 40-page article? Well, then you're spending hours doing something that you could be doing something else. So start with the title, find good titles, read abstracts. If it's specific enough to what you're interested in, or if it's something or specific enough to your research question, or if it's just something you're interested in, then skim through the intro and discussion. The intro and discussion is going to give you an idea of what the intro is going to give you an idea of what they were looking for. The discussion is going to give you an idea of what they found. You don't necessarily have to read the method and results unless you are then interested in the stats and how they collected the data. So once you get to the point where you're doing your own study and you need to figure out how you're going to construct your research, how you're going to conduct everything, what the participants are, how you're going to do that, then you would look through the methods and results of specific ones that are closely related. But for the most part, you're not going to ever look at methods and results. You're going to look at just skimming the intro and discussion. And then again, like I said, every once in a while, read the entire article carefully when it is very important or when it's confusing, things like that. And then after all of that's done, go to the references section. And from that references section, expand your literature search. Because in that references section is going to be other articles of note. You can probably go back to the intro and find the parts of the intro that they cited specifically, but even then they might be only citing one specific small part of another study in which other parts of that study may be more relevant to what you're looking for. That's why it's good to go through the references, look at titles in the references, and then go to and get abstracts from that. So how do you know when you're done? How do you know when to end a literature search? Well, that's up to you. When you feel comfortable with your knowledge about the topic area and you've found some recent research studies that are particularly relevant or close to what you're looking at. If you're doing a replication study, then you have looked at the study you're replicating and look at other things that have occurred since that study occurred, and that might be enough. If you're doing something new and novel, you need to find stuff that's closely related to it, and basically once you're comfortable with the topic. How many articles is enough? There isn't a specific quantity. You just have to find enough that you've got justification for your new research. When you're writing the introduction to your paper, you're going to introduce the topic. You're going to have to cite things when you're introducing the topic. You're going to have to cite other papers. You're going to introduce research that's already been done on that topic related to yours. So you're going to have to cite those. Then you're going to maybe possibly introduce another research article that's very similar, or maybe was the same, but they studied it in a different way, or maybe was the same, but they studied it on different participants, those types of things. And then you cite them. But you need those sources. So you need to have those sources to justify your new research. And then, of course, you propose your new research. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but when you're writing like the introduction to your paper, it's like a funnel. It starts out really broad. You've got the broad topic, and then you get more and more specific, more and more narrow, until you're down to just a fine point, and that fine point is your research study that you are doing. I already talked about this next one quite a bit, but let's rehash that. Let's look at it again. And that is how to find a research idea from a published research article. And as I said already, researchers are very open. Sometimes researchers are very competitive and they can be very cutthroat, but in general, researchers are very open. They want more people doing research in the field they're doing. Young grad students, when they're first starting out grad school, undergrads who do research, they want to be they want to find the new great thing, and they want to have they want to be the only one. However, as you do more research, you come to realize the more people that are doing research on what you're interested in, the more chances there is of what you're doing being interesting to the public. And I already talked about this, there isn't enough time. There is just not enough time. You might have enough time to do some things, but not everything. So you've got enough time to do a study, but not 2 studies. Maybe you've got enough time to do 2 studies, but you don't have enough time to do 3 studies. There is always going to be another study as a researcher that you want to do, that looks interesting to you. However, there isn't necessarily the time to do that. So what authors do, what researchers will do, is at the end of their discussion, at the end of their paper, they will put a section with unanswered questions, with suggestions for future research. They're not suggesting future research because that's what they're going to do. They're suggesting future research because that's what they want someone else to do. They want someone else to take up that and do that research. They also talk about limitations to their studies, and that is something that can be expanded on. So these are the types of things that researchers put at the end of their papers, not because they're just trying to be humble or not because they're saying this is what their future research is going to be. They're doing that because what they are trying to do is they are trying to get other researchers to take it up and do that research as well. If you've only got time for 2 studies and you want 3 studies done and somebody else does one of those studies, then everything got done. If you've only got time for 2 studies and you want 3 studies done and somebody else does 2 of those 3 studies, guess what? You just had time for 1 of your studies and you've got time to branch out into something entirely new. And that's fun. So when it comes to these, authors are very often going to say what they want, what they recommend doing, and they're recommending this based on their knowledge of the topic. And if they're publishing on it, they're probably pretty knowledgeable about it. So go to that section and look at some of the unanswered questions, some of the suggestions for future research, some of the limitations, and see if you can come up with a research idea based on that. You can also take 2 existing results and combine them together. Let's say one person found X and another person found Y. You can take both X and Y, combine them together, and see if they can be found in a new way, that type of thing. Let's transition now into the components of a research article. And it's here because when you're doing a literature review and whatnot, you need to know what you're looking for, what to read, things like that. But at the same time, this is the components of pretty much every research article. And as you go through the labs, you are going to be doing the different parts of this. And by the end, you're going to compile it all together into one paper. So first, we've got the introduction. The introduction, technically first you've got the title, then second you've got the abstract, but you actually don't write the abstract until the end. The introduction is the first part of the body of the research. The introduction, the content from the introduction is going to be a literature review. So the literature review you do is going to basically put into written form, and then part of the introduction. And as I said, this is a funnel. So your literature review, it starts out very broad, and it gets more and more specific. And more specific. Then you get to your hypothesis or purpose for the study. You're down in here, you're very specific, and then you get your specific prediction. That's where this comes together. We'll even put the arrow here. Your specific prediction that's based on your hypotheses. So that's basically what the introduction does. Then the methods, which is the second section, which you are not going to write second, but we will come back to the methods later. You're going to write part of it, and then you're going to come back to more of it later. The methods is you're going to talk about your participants, and you're going to talk about your procedures that you did during your study. So your participants and your procedure. You also will talk in this about analyses. So that's part of the procedures, but analyses. What analyses you're going to conduct. Maybe you use some special stats techniques. This is at the end of the methods, you would put the special stats techniques that you're going to use in your results. So that's the methods. The next is the results, and this tends to be relatively short. It's going to be the statistical, both descriptive and inferential statistics that were used in the study. It's going to be the results, basically. It's going to be the results that you ran the stats on. So you run the stats, and you publish those stats, or you write those stats up in APA format, and you put those in the results section. Sometimes you'll put graphs and charts in here, sometimes you won't, but basically this is where you're writing up what you got from the results of your stats. Then you go to your discussion. So results is just the stats. It's the stats written in APA format, but it's just the stats. There is no interpretation of the results. It's just the stated results. The discussion now is where you're going to interpret the results. So you're going to bring those results back related to your hypothesis. Did it support your hypothesis? Did it refute your hypothesis? Was it not good enough to use as an analysis for your hypothesis? You're looking at justified conclusions. You're looking at alternate explanations. All of that is where you're looking at basically interpreting your results in terms of your research hypotheses. And finally, it's that limitations, generalizations, future directions, all of that is something you'll put in the discussion as well. And you'll finish up with the references section, which is going to be a list of all items cited that you cited throughout the paper prior to that. So when you're looking at reading research articles for your literature review, keep in mind these are the sections. That's why I mentioned that the results, the methods and results is something you generally don't read when you're doing a literature review. You start with that abstract, but then you skim the introduction and discussion, because the introduction is leading you up to the topic at hand, and the discussion is interpreting the results of that study in terms of the hypotheses. This gets us to learning objective 5, which is to identify and demonstrate the characteristics of a good hypothesis. So what is the characteristics of a good hypothesis? First is that it's logical. It has to be the logical conclusion of a logical argument. When you're reading out your hypotheses, once you guys do your hypotheses in one of the labs, if I read your hypotheses, I should be able to, just from your hypotheses, without even reading the rest of your introduction, just from your hypotheses, I should be able to clearly understand the logic of your hypotheses. I should be able to understand what you're saying in that hypothesis and the logical argument you are making in that hypothesis. Next, it has to be testable. All of the variables, events, and individuals can be defined and observed. This is a very important characteristic of science, that it has to be testable. So it has to be something we can test. When you look at things like the id, the ego, and the superego in psychoanalytic theory, those aren't things that can be observed. They can barely be defined. They are not something that we can test. So in that case, it's not testable. So whatever your hypothesis is, it has to be something that you can construct a study. Now, maybe the hypotheses are beyond the scope of a simple survey, but it should be possible for you to construct a test, a study that tests your hypotheses. And when you get to doing your hypotheses, you're going to need at least one that's testable with a survey. You'll be able to post other hypotheses there that are maybe elaborate and can't be tested with a survey. You're not going to be testing those, but you need at least one that you can test with a survey. Next is the hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. What does that mean? It means it needs to be possible to be demonstrated as false. It doesn't mean you're going to demonstrate it as false. It doesn't mean that it is false. It just means that it is possible within the study that you're setting up to, if results end up a certain way, it's going to disprove what you're testing. Psychic abilities are not falsifiable. You can't, at least not as, I mean, you can falsify them in studies where you're controlling all the conditions, but as psychics explain their own psychic abilities, they're not falsifiable because they'll say when they're being observed, it doesn't work. Well, that just made it non-falsifiable, because if you can't possibly show that it's not true, that it's false, if there's no possible way to do that, then it's not falsifiable, then it's not science, then it's not a good hypothesis. And finally, it's positive. What do I mean by positive? I don't mean good. I don't mean like the opposite of negative, positive charge. You just have to make a positive statement about the existence of something. What's a good example of that is something like, let's say you're testing to see if a medication has an effect on headaches. Your hypotheses will be something along the lines positive, as in the positive statement about the existence of something. I hypothesize that this new drug will reduce headaches more than the previous drug. So it is a positive statement about the existence of something. I'm not saying that this new drug is not as good as previous drugs. This new drug is taken away or anything like that. Those aren't clear enough and just a positive statement about the existence of something as saying this new drug will reduce, the hypothesis will reduce headaches more than previous painkillers. We'll talk about that more later when we're talking about hypotheses and stuff. But these are things you're going to have to do in labs. You're going to have to do a literature review. You're going to have to write up an introduction where you do that funnel, where you start general and get more specific. You're going to have hypotheses and aims. Aims are basically ways to test hypotheses. You're going to have to do all of that. So, in review, we looked at this. As I said, it was relatively short. Learning objective 1 is to identify the early steps in the research project. Learning process. Learning objective 2 is to compare and contrast sources of research ideas. Learning objective 3 is to understand the components of a literature review. Learning objective 4 is to conduct a comprehensive literature review, which you will do in lab 3. And learning objective 5 is identify and demonstrate the characteristics of a good hypothesis, which I believe you're doing in lab 5, somewhere in there. Maybe it's 6, but I think it's 5. Okay, thanks. Come on back.